media and deconstruct the stories for you. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is a journalist, publisher, Black Star News, a broadcaster, WBAI.org, 99.5 FM, New York Radio. He teaches African history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He holds degrees in journalism and economics from Columbia and Syracuse universities, respectively. His book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media, a copy you see here, inspired this program. I would also mention he's an explorer in his spare time, and amongst his remarkable discoveries is London's main river, which he named the River Gulu. I speak of none other than Comrade Milton Allimadi. Welcome, and how have you been?
Asante Ndugu. Thank you as always.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And yes, the week has been very interesting, to say the least, both on your side of the pond, my side, but our focus is Africa as always. And for the first story, we go to the story that has been in the news. So this is almost like a further down the line story. And I speak of Kenya. Kenya has been in the news, and this time it seems we're about to understand what the undercurrent for the story is. Our first story comes from the Financial Times, and it's titled, Kenya's Mass Protests Expose Africans' Fury with the IMF. The lead says William Ruto is the latest president of developing country caught between multilateral lenders and angry population. It's as Kenya reels from deadly anti-tax riots, which has rocked East Africa's most advanced economy. The target of Africa's protesters' angers remains starkly clear in murals on the walls of central Nairobi. And it's not just the government. IMF, keep your hands off Kenya, says one pointed slogan. As live rounds crackle and police deploy tear gas in Nairobi streets, 25-year-old protesters Job Morebi said the IMF is involved in bringing this chaos upon Kenya. For many Kenyans, the unrest that forced President William Ruto last month to withdraw a finance bill aimed at raising more than $2 billion in taxes has laid bare the role of Washington's based multilateral lenders in the country's policymaking. Kenya is not the only African country where citizens are rejecting austerity measures often imposed to appease multilateral lenders that demand fiscal discipline in exchange for cheap loans. In Nigeria, where President Bola Tinubu has delivered a series of shock therapies, including reducing petrol subsidies, cutting electricity support, and devaluing the currency, labor unions have gone on strike in protest. The country received $2.25 billion in World Bank loan package last month, accompanied by a praise for critical reforms on the way. On Olusegun Obasanjo, the former president of Nigeria, told the Financial Times that the prescription from IMF and the World Bank may work for developed countries, but were not right for emerging economies. African states should be the architect of their own fortune, he added. If the World Bank and the IMF are the architect for us, we will fail, Obasanjo said. He said staff at the lenders were brilliant, first class in Cambridge and Ivy League school, but unfit to make recommendations for millions of people in developing countries. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that it's good to see the Financial Times being much more honest than The Economist or the New York Times. Because remember, we had a conversation a short while ago in one of our episodes. And I said the crisis in Kenya is not so much Ruto. I said we could change the name, and it's not about Ruto. Yeah, it could have the name, it could be any other president in Kenya. It could be Uhuru Kenyatta, right?
Okay.
And I also said that it's almost as if they've been listening to our show, actually. Because I also said that what Kenya was experiencing, and that, of course, when people had been killed during the protest, I said what Kenya is experiencing is potentially liable to happen in any one of those African countries because the conditions are exactly the same. I said they do not own their production. I said if your budget is drawn by the World Bank, how can you call yourself a sovereign country? You know, we had this conversation. I don't know whether it was the last episode or the episode before that. So now I like to see an establishment media, the Financial Times, laying it out clearly that obviously this is not just a Kenyan situation. This is the most honest coverage that I've seen in a mainstream publication, establishment publication that is outlining the challenges that Kenya faces. And it's 100% true and correct. In fact, there's only one part of this story that we're discussing that I thought was slightly dishonest when it suggested that not all African countries are critical of the IMF World Bank regime. And then it mentioned Ghana, but that was a very disingenuous reference. It said Ghana had said they're not going to take IMF money, and then civil society put pressure on the government to change its mind, and then finally the government yielded. But that is hardly a support for the thing. That was under duress.
Correct.
You know, it was totally under duress that the government did that. And to be honest with you, it's taken its toll on Ghana, and who knows what the total implication in Ghana of that thing. But it's a major problem, and you're referencing Nigeria, the same problem in Nigeria, and you can name any other African country. And historically, many of the more astute African leaders have resisted being involved with the IMF World Bank. For example, in Tanzania, the late Julius Nyerere refused to take IMF bailout. You know, his Minister of Finance would argue with him. We really need it. To his credit, he never took a loan from the IMF until he retired as president. Then, of course, afterwards, Tanzania started becoming involved with the IMF. The same thing with Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. He also refused to take IMF loan because he knows the consequences. The consequences are what you see the young people of Kenya now protesting against. But I guess the other point I can add is that I think when we discussed South Africa a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, and I was very critical of the Economist and the New York Times celebrating the so-called government of national unity between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, the DA, the party controlled by the Europeans. And I said, this is nothing to celebrate. This is short-lived because the ANC is the party of national liberation. The Democratic Alliance is the party of apartheid. They don't want land reform. They don't want any special measures to create jobs to the millions of unemployed Black people. Black unemployment is 37 to 40% of unemployment. European unemployment is only about 7.4%, and they make 7.2% of the population. And I said, the Europeans who are now part of government in South Africa have a way to enforce their way. And I said it would be their friends who run the IMF and the World Bank. So any of the situations that we've discussed involves external control over Africa's economy, over Africa's production, and over Africa's consumption, because you can only consume what you produce. and what you import. And in order for them to import, they have to, they're forced into taking these loans. And then the interest rate, the article says, has people there saying it's low relative to other rates. Well, it's not low based on the income of Africans. Otherwise, Kenyans would not be coming out to the street, and 38 of them would not have been killed by the security forces. But then one other point I have to make. I think what we are seeing on the African continent is the same struggle to get control over your resources. To get paid adequate rate for your resources, to be able to manufacture and to replace these imports that we currently import from the industrialized countries, and to get control of the debt. So they manifest themselves in different ways. Whether it's a popularly supported coup in Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger, whether it's the young people coming out in the streets in Nairobi and other parts of Kenya, it is part of the same struggle. And I think at the end of the day, I don't know how long this process will take, we're going to see a change in the form of government in African countries. Because this type of fictitious government that we inherited from the West really is not suitable for the African condition,
Yeah. And also, just to add, what would you say is your take with regards to this lends itself actually to the book How Europe Was Underdeveloped by Africa?
All right, so
I think you're getting an echo.
I'm just doing a volume check. Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you clearly prior to you adjusting.
Okay, very good. So in terms of that book, of course, captures the entire essence. And that book, I know many of our sisters and brothers, sometimes they get intimidated when you start talking about books. But the book lays it out, how you're going to develop Africa. But in addition to the book, if they don't have time, sisters and brothers, if you don't have time to read the book, please listen to the lectures on YouTube, where Walter Rodney, the author of that book, lays out the same thing we're discussing right now. One of the best lectures, I think we mentioned in the past, Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. And then another one is a lecture, actually it's an interview by the late Samir Amin, called Africa's Industrialization Challenge. And it will discuss everything that is now unfolding in Kenya. And you'll understand why the youth are coming out on the streets in Kenya.
Okay. We go to. I'm getting an echo. You want to move your microphone away from the speaker of the computer. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Is that better?
Better. Fantastic.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me though?
I can hear you.
Okay. So speaking of income, we go to our next story, which is from the EU, and it's essentially what you were talking about, the failure to industrialize. And by that, we're talking about the EU, who has decided we're going to rewrite the rules. And this story comes from The Economist, and it's titled, How EU Do-Goodry Risk Harming African Small Farmers. New forest mapping rules may shut African crops out of the European market. Sacks of coffee are piled up high in an Ethiopian warehouse, dwarfing the workers who scurry between them. Our farmers' lives are dependent on this coffee, says Dijene Daddy Dika, the general manager of the Oromo Coffee Farmers Cooperative Union, which have more than 500,000 member farms. He is worried about a new EU deforestation regulation, which requires that every bean sold in Europe be traced to the field it came from. It costs the co-op about $4 to geolocate each farm, and he wonders who will pay. With the stroke of a pen, the EU is rewriting trading practices the world over. It is bringing cocoa, coffee, rubber, soya, palm oil, wood, and cattle products into Europe to prove that these commodities did not come from land which was deforested after 2020. So what do you think will be the impact of such a new rule? Can you hear me?
Okay, I think there's a little problem with the volume again. I heard parts of what you're reading. Did you pose the question already?
Yes, I did. Okay.
Yeah, there's some challenge with the volume, but
you want to try.
But I think I heard enough of what you were reading to give you my views on it.
You want to try without the headphones? Try without the headphones.
Hang on. Okay, how's that?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so my view on this particular topic is a bit contrarian.
Okay.
And I'll explain in two parts. Number one, obviously, in theory, I support what the premise is all about, right?
Okay.
The premise is, of course, the issue of deforestation, which, of course, is a major crisis globally and particularly in Africa as well. Because in Africa, we have the remaining potential savior of the earth, right? We still have dense forest, dense growth, and obviously we need that for the carbon capture to sustain the world as we know it. Okay. So I can see the incentive to come up with these mechanisms to discourage the deforestation, the mass cutting down of these trees. So the article is posing the premise that, on the other hand, while that in fact is good, it has other consequences as well. It has other costs. So what is the solution? So they're presenting it as if it's a choice. We either ignore putting any restrictions because we don't want African farmers to suffer. So let the deforestation essentially continue, which is, of course, a very absurd argument. Even by the standards of the economists, it's preposterous. We can't have that, number one. And then number two, I actually see it as an opportunity. First of all, I must say, even though the article sounds like sort of an alarmist tone, this proposal is unenforceable. It's completely unenforceable. Okay. They don't have the resources to enforce it. They're not going to say, okay, let's see whether those, first of all, how do you know the borders of those farms, right? Because many of them are small-scale producers, not large plantations. So you're saying these small farms that are adjoining, one each next to the other, are going to have to invest into unique geo-mapping devices. That to me is completely preposterous. I don't see how you enforce that. Okay. It sounds like it's good on paper, but it's going to be very difficult to enforce. But that was not my main point. My main point is that this is finally assuming it is enforceable going forward,
Okay.
it's actually going to compel African countries to stop exporting those huge bags, those huge sacks packed with cocoa, packed with coffee, packed with soya beans, packed with so-called unprocessed agricultural commodities,
For next to
right?
nothing.
That's what they're doing now with their agricultural products. That's what they're doing now with the minerals that come from the earth. So now is an opportunity to start manufacturing. So export the cocoa as nicely packaged chocolates,
Place. Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they buying it in sacks in the first place? They're buying it in sacks because they want to maximize the value once they put it through their factories. They're not doing anything magical to the coffee or the cocoa. They're just processing and then repackaging it. And that is why they insist on buying it in these huge sacks. And if you ban the sacks, they'll find other ways of containers to ship it. So it seems to me that this is now an opportunity for you to actually say, if you really want to help us, we don't need geomapping. We don't need any funds to enforce the deforestation. We can do it by producing and then converting this into value-added products. So the coffee now comes in containers, shipped straight to Whole Food. You buy it in containers, and you're getting a percentage of that higher value. So if it's selling at $15 or $20 a particular container, why should you not be able to get $10 out of that, 50% to even 70%? Since you, and I don't know how the economics works in terms of the shipping costs, the tariffs, and all that other stuff. But it seems to me that this is actually a golden opportunity for African countries going forward. So while the economist sees it as a tragedy, I see it as a potential golden opportunity once and for all for African countries to really wean themselves off that dependency on exporting bulky, raw, and processed materials to the West and of course to China as well.
Okay. And so while one country is seeking, or the entire continent are seeking to avoid geotagging, one is seeking fairer deals with regards to how their foreign partners deal with them. So we speak of Senegal. Senegal sets, and this story comes from Radio France International. Senegal sets out to secure fairer partnership in mining sector. The lead says a Senegal recently elected president Bassirou Diomaye Faye has promised to renegotiate mining, gas, and oil contracts signed with foreign companies at a top-level summit in Paris this week. His mining minister sets out how the new government plans to break away from old practices. Speaking at this year's Mining on Top Africa conference, Birame Soaye Diop, Senegal's Minister of Energy and Mines, said his government intends to review the contract of mining companies that do not fulfill their environmental obligation. A few days ago, I visited Kedudu, and Diop said, referring to the region which houses most of Kenya's Senegal's industrial and artisanal gold mines, located 700 kilometers east of the capital, Dakar, and close to Malian border. It is one of the country's poorest regions, and it's also subject to widespread contamination. The water of Falame River is totally polluted. Animals are dying, children are dying, forests have been decimated, Diop said. This because of poisoning by cyanide and mercury used for gold mining. This is not fair, he says. And I think it goes back to what you were saying with regards to a possibility for a reset. and maybe the home government can now take a leaf out of what has gone before and sort of reset to say, listen, if you intend to do business with us, this is our terms of the business arrangement. You don't stick with it, we kick you out. What do you think?
So in fact, this article has similar echoes to what I just spoke about in terms of the Economist article, which of course was condemning deforestation. And I said that's only part of it. They can turn it to their advantage by using value added. So now the Senegalese, the new young leadership, is talking about the same thing that I was just describing. But now, instead of agricultural commodities, they're talking about the minerals that come from our subsoil. And of course, it's the same echo. You know, why are we, first of all, he revealed something, and I'm glad they're being very honest about it, because many African officials would not be willing to admit that we actually don't even know how much the value of our resources are, right? Because they don't share data with us, right? And of course, we know why they don't share data, because they want to continue cheating and exploiting. And that is the reason why they don't share data. But that was a remarkable revelation when a whole minister in the government says that the foreign multinational actually know more about our own resources.
Wow.
I commend him for his honesty. And I must say, that probably applies to every African country, because I cannot imagine that when they come there for prospecting, that the information that they obtain, they're going to give you the accurate information. That would not make sense.
True.
There's a built-in incentive to cheat, to say that we have discovered less. Because you have to pay for the concessions, right?
Correct.
So if it's a huger concession, you have to pay a lot more. So they're going to minimize the level of resources that they've discovered through their prospecting, and they're the ones who have the equipment for the prospecting, you see? So we pretty much have to go with the numbers that they declare. And we know the numbers preposterous because, first of all, you know that pretty much every major multinational company does not pay the adequate share of taxes in the African countries where they operate. So if they don't do that, why are they going to give you accurate data on what they've discovered through their own digging and research on the ground? So thank you, Mr. Minister. So that is one major challenge, right?
Okay.
But then, of course, the second major challenge is the challenge that has always been the case since independence. How do we get our fair cut, right? In the absence of getting a fair cut, and you will never get a fair cut, right? Is to use the resources yourself to manufacture products that you can then use, so there is no need to export. And you can also start exporting and competing in the international market. And you don't have to see the international market as Europe, North America, Asia. Your international market is actually domestic. It is the African market itself.
Yep.
So if an African country is producing smartphones, the entire market is the rest of Africa, right? True. If an African country is producing automobiles, their market likewise is Africa. Remember what Sankara said? You know, let's produce what we consume as Africa, and let's consume what we produce.
Yeah.
Our trade, intra-African trade, remains at less than 15%. That is just abominable. Europeans, among themselves, their trade level is more than 80%. And that applies to the United States also with its trade, with other so-called developed countries or the industrialized countries. That's also 80%.
Yeah.
So we are ceding our African market to them, partly because we are not producing the things that all of us as Africans then end up importing from Europe, from the United States, and from China. So I like what the minister said in terms of trying to create some competition, saying we are not looking for investors only from Europe. If we can get good deals and offers from Saudi Arabia, that's where they need to go. But they need to think beyond that. They need to deal with investors, and he actually did say that. And perhaps the article itself did not elaborate on what he spoke about, because he mentioned the fact that they need to share technology, right? And sharing technology means we need to benefit from that technology in order to industrialize, to use this our raw resources the same way that they use it once they ship it overseas to their own countries. So I think that's what he meant, but sadly it was not elaborated on in that particular article. And then, of course, the danger remains the same. If this conversation is coming only from these young leaders in Senegal, they will do everything in their power to make sure they don't stay long in power. You see? And that is a problem.
Yes.
So this is why this needs to be a regional conversation. There needs to be a Pan-African conversation.
Yeah.
That's the only way we can protect ourselves. Going back to Kenya, Kenya cannot deal with that issue with the IMF and World Bank by itself. Kenya will not be able to survive. It needs to be a pan-East African conversation and a pan-African conversation. You know, you can't be having these kind of concessions in Kenya, and then they'll say, okay, well, Ruto, if you're not going to deliver, you know, we'll support somebody else who's willing to sign on the dotted line, and you'll be gone. And then run to Tanzania and do the same thing. The Africans need to be on the same, have the same policy when it comes to industrial policy, when it comes to investment policy. Otherwise, they'll do what they've been doing for 60 years, which is undercut one African by finding another one who's willing to accept these policies uncritically. And that's always been the problem, you know.
And also, another problem they might possibly face, I'm talking about the African continent, is the destabilization in itself would spread to the regional bodies around. And then before you know it, you don't have that way.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm losing your sound.
Can you hear me?
I'm losing your sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can only see your lips moving now.
Okay, you want to unplug your headphones? You want to unplug your headphones?
Can you try?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, okay, you can hear me.
Without the headphone, you're going to be getting echoes, but at least I can hear you now.
Okay, so what that means is when I'm speaking, I'll probably mute you.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay, so the point I was making is with those African countries destabilized and not being able to determine their own course of action with regards to the power of the agencies they're dealing with, in this case, the IMF, and in Senegal's case now, international financiers, some of these national companies are the size of countries, the kind of money they make, most of these countries can only, experiencing from time to time. And so I suppose my question to you would be, aside from coming together within the African continent, would it not, in line with Brother Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, to really focus on industrialization? What do you say?
Well, that's a problem. They don't have the capital to industrialize because they've not been focusing on the policies that are required to industrialize. They've been prevented from pursuing the strategies that would allow industrialization. And those, of course, are the dictates of the World Bank and the IMF. In order to industrialize, and anybody can go back and look at the history, industrialization has been a joint project between government and private sector. Anybody who says it's been done by private companies is not being honest. It's just purely lying. In every case, the government has taken a role and decided that these are going to be our priorities. If it's producing automobiles, they will impose taxes that will make it very costly for automobiles to be imported into that country. So they're basically subsidizing their industrialization. They're injecting subsidized public capital into the corporations that are going to be manufacturing cars, whether it's privately owned or a joint project between government and private sector. So they're discriminating in favor of this government project. So I'm just giving you one example of automobiles, because automobiles, of course, is one of the more traditional ways of becoming part of this industrial process. And then you protect the market, and every country that did so, did the same way. So initially, automobiles from South Korea, people would not think much of it. People would not even want to import it. But it's fine. They have a domestic market. They're protected. They're domestic producers from competition from outside. So they have a guaranteed market. It's almost like the colonialists had guaranteed markets when there were colonial powers in Africa. If it was Britain, nobody else is going to be able to export manufacturers to Nigeria or to Ghana or to Uganda. So now you're flipping it around. You are monopolizing the domestic market until such a time that your automobile, maybe it takes 5 years, maybe 10 years, is now been tested, it's been upgraded, the quality is high. Now, even if you open the market, your domestic consumers might say, well, you know what? Our car is actually good. Forget this import from Britain or the United States. Our car is now competitive because it was protected for that 5 to 10 year period. In fact, now we can export it to other parts of the world, whether it was the car, whether it was our own computer, whether it's our own smartphone, whether it's pharmaceuticals for hospitals. But now we can compete with anybody because for a period of time, just like every country has done, we protected our market until our product was ready to compete. But the World Bank and IMF will not allow you to do that, because one of the conditions this big lie, they say we have to let the free market operate. So if you agree that the free market must operate, why are you coming to me, the World Bank, and saying, Mr. World Bank, I need to protect the domestic car industry for Nigerian manufacturers until the Fela model, the Fela Kuti model of automobiles can compete with Nissan, right? So I need 10 years before the Fela car is ready to compete. So I'm going to discriminate. I'm going to have high tariffs. The World Bank will say high tariffs violates the norms of the free market. If you do that, I'm sorry, we can't lend you money. And then if the World Bank says we can't lend you money, Citibank will say the same thing. Chase will say the same thing. all these major global financial outlets will say the same thing. They're on the same condition. And that is the challenge we face. Where do we get the capital to industrialize? That is why you see the Western establishment very critical of BRICS, because BRICS, at least in theory, is offering the potential of becoming an alternative market, which does not come with these conditions. So we are contemplating that at one point, Nigeria can actually come to BRICS countries and saying, BRICS, we have a project to produce high quality cars within 15 years. So BRICS, this is the type of capital we need. So now that you're not getting the money from the World Bank or IMF, you can set those tariffs to protect the FELA model. That is the kind of conversation we need to be having in Africa if we are to transform. And I think we have no choice. These crises that we're seeing erupting here and there, they're actually manifestations of the same crises, as I said in the beginning of this show. Not being able to control our sovereignty, not being able to produce manufactured, not being able to get adequate returns on our mineral and natural resources, having to end up borrowing from World Bank and IMF and spending more than 10% of our income on servicing just the interest on the debt alone. Forget about interest repayment.
Okay, so one other thing. That said, we will go to the next story, and it's your friend, and Paul Kagame is on the verge of re-election. Paul Kagame is expected to be re-elected as Rwanda goes to polls. And, the news coming out of is that he has over 90% of the vote. So technically he has won. And so the story goes, and this story comes from The Guardian. So people in Rwanda have gone to the polls for elections in which Paul Kagame is widely expected to extend his rule of the Central African country. And this is the fourth presidential election since more than 100,000 people, mostly members of the Tutsi ethnic minority, were killed in a genocide in the country 30 years ago. Kagame, who led the Rwanda Patriotic Rebel Group to defeat Hutu extremist forces and end the genocide, was elected president by parliament in 2000 after the resignation of Pastor Bizimungu. He had won more than 90% of the vote in the previous three elections since in 2003, 2010, and 2017. In this election, he faces the same opponents as in 2017, Frank Habineza of the Democratic Green Party of Rwanda and Philip Mapiyama, an independent candidate. Rwanda's National Electoral Commission disqualified 6 others, including vocal Kagame critics Victoria Ingabire, Dan Rigara, and Bernard Ugantanga, for various reasons. Kagame's campaign priorities have included security, stability, unity, and the economic development. We choose to rebuild ourselves and our country, which was destroyed by bad politics and irresponsible leaders, he said at a rally in northern Gakenka district on Thursday. And over to you, sir.
Okay, so this is basically a press release, and I think in one of the previous coverages of, I think it was last month, heading up to election, the Guardian, and also expressed, my serious disappointment with the Guardian, because the Guardian is much better than that. It normally offers, so for example, today in our discussion, I was shocked by the Financial Times in giving a very sober analysis of the IMF and the consequences of its conditions on African countries. That type of article you typically would get from The Guardian. So The Guardian has given us a kind of article that I doubt even that the Economist would offer, but perhaps they would actually. So, for example, by saying he won 90% of the vote in 3 previous elections without elaborating and explaining that obviously he did because they were rigged elections. So you're endorsing a complete lie and falsehood. You're doing public relations on behalf of the government, which is very tragic for publication of The Guardian. But I assure you the reasons why they do that, because The Guardian, these are not naive people who have just come out of high school and are just practicing journalism for the first time. They know that to present a more wholesome report, they probably will not be allowed to come back to report from the country. So they've made that trade to produce essentially press releases to have the ability to return to report from the country. And of course, I'm not just saying this out of the blue. This was the experience of the BBC. When the BBC produced and broadcast the documentary Rwanda's Untold Story, which I think in a previous discussion I reminded people was never broadcast in the United States and was not promoted for long after the government of Kagame accused the BBC of genocide denial and banned the BBC from reporting from Rwanda for some time. So the BBC has made amendments, and its amendments has been to rely more on press release type coverage. And the Guardian is emulating that same type of journalism and does not benefit the people of Rwanda in the long run. It does not, because at some point there needs to be a transition. One person does not last forever, and what happens the day after, you see? And that's the problem. Now, if you have major media, such as The Guardian, basically just reproducing the PR narrative, that is a problem. So to me, the major problem here is not so much what has happened in Rwanda, but it is the uncritical coverage that is regurgitated by The Guardian for the rest of the world. And I'm glad we have an opportunity to discuss it here so that our listeners, and if you're not familiar with the history, anybody who's listening to us, I strongly recommend if you Google the documentary, Rwanda's Untold Story, it will take you to Venmo, where you can see this documentary. It's less than an hour. You'll be able to see, and you'll understand the missing gaps in the Guardian article. The documentary will address those issues.
Yeah, thank you for that. And our final story comes from just south of the border from you, and it comes from Haiti. And it's from the New York Times, and it's why foreign officers are policing Haiti. And the lead says about 400 Kenyan officers have deployed to Haiti as part of the first wave of multinational contingent tax with trying to restore orders in the gang-plagued Caribbean nation. Foreign law, and it's actually penned by your friend, Abdul Latif Dahir. Foreign law enforcement officers started arriving in Haiti late last month, more than a year and a half, after the prime minister there issued a plea to other countries for help to stop the rampant gang violence that has upended the Caribbean nation. 400 officers from Kenya were the first contingent of a deployment of officers from 8 nations. Their job was to try to wrest control of Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, from dozens of armed groups that have attacked police stations, freed prisoners, and killed with impunity. And the Kenyan police have a checkered history back home, accused by human rights groups of killing and abusing civilians, raising concerns about their actions in Haiti. Here is what we know about the multinational mission. Since Haiti's appeal for international help went out in October 2022, more than 8,000 people have died in the violence there, over 3,000 so far this year alone, the United Nations says. The Kenyans in Haiti are the first to deploy of an expected 2,500 member force, and enforcement largely organized by Biden's administration. There is a long history of international force being sent to Haiti for the stated purpose of restoring law and order, but have left behind grim legacies of civilian casualties, sexual exploitation, and disease. Over to you, sir.
Okay, very good. So, well, you know my position on the deployment of the Kenyan security forces into Haiti. And from a broader view, it's more like an American project. It was promoted, encouraged by the United States. The Biden administration and Kenya has become a willing partner or volunteer. So that is offhand my initial view. But at the same time, I care deeply for our sisters and brothers in Haiti. So I want to be optimistic. I want something to work for our sisters and brothers in Haiti. I don't want the condition under which they live right now to continue perpetually. If there's any chance that the Kenyan deployment can improve conditions on the ground, then of course I'll be supportive. And I wish them a safety. I hope that because I know one of the leaders of the militias on the ground, sometimes referred to as gangs, Barbecue is his nickname, had made some threats, but so far there have not been any conflict between the intervention force and any of these armed groups on the ground. I hope it continues that way. Obviously, for that not to occur, it means that the force would have to be seen as more than the 400 Kenyan security forces. The other countries that have also pledged support, such as Bahamas, I think it's Bahamas or Barbados, or maybe both, Jamaica, Chad, and these countries need also to step forward. But my suspicion is that none of them is going to step forward until after the US elections in November, because they want to make sure that this, if there's a change in US administration, that the Trump administration would be on board with this project, because it's still funded by the United States. The equipment, the salary of the Kenyan intervention, and presumably the intervention forces that are to come from other countries, for a total of 2,500. So that needs to be, they need to be financed by somebody for their upkeep, the equipment they need, the armored personnel carriers, and so on and so forth. And if there's any fear by these other countries that have pledged a commitment that there might be a change in US policy, then of course they're not going to be willing to deploy. So I think some of them may sit it out and see what happens in November. And of course, that would be very challenging for Kenya, because it means that Kenya would be carrying the burden alone. And if these armed groups get the indication after some time that, well, you know what, I don't think Kenya is going to be getting any other support, then they might start becoming much more aggressive, and we could see confrontation. So that's why the timing may be problematic, especially when we see how things are going in the United States in terms of challenger Trump being seen and shown in the polls, actually, as leading the incumbent in many of the key critical states that anyone needs to win in order to become president. So I think the US election is playing a role in this Haitian operation as well.
There's one more thing I wanted to raise, and I think you touched on it: the issue of who is financing the uh, the force, with majority of the funds coming from the United States. Is it safe to assume that we're not exactly being altruistic here, and this is one that is geared towards protecting certain interests, by and large that of United States, Canada, and France in Haiti, or am I just being pessimistic?
No, you're not being pessimistic at all. In fact, it's and that's been part of the challenge. Why, in addition to people wanting to sit out and see what happens in the election, there's also been in the background the unwillingness of some parties to become involved, some countries to become involved, saying this is a Western agenda once again, and masked as a global intervention, with Kenya being the African face of this intervention, because it looks much more better, at least optically, than having European forces, intervention forces deployed on the ground in Haiti. I think definitely the funding could come from elsewhere as well. I can see a few African countries being willing to commit more men and women on the ground if it's seen as a more than U.S. deployment. So, for example, why can some funds come from China? Why can some funds not come from some of the EU countries, or the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries? These are people who are always preaching about peace and global security, correct? So if that is true, then it must also apply to the people of Haiti. They should also benefit from peace and global security. So if a concerted pitch can be made to these other countries, in fact, I think they should start making that pitch now. So, and you wonder how dynamic the transitional government, the members are, the transitional government in Haiti. In fact, you have much more incentive now to reach out to other sources of potential funding, because now there's no assurance that the current U.S. administration will be in office beyond January, you see? So now is the time, and if they're still there, then it's fine. Then, whatever new actors you can bring on board is just a bonus. And if they're not there, you have at least some other actors on board. And the project won't just collapse. Because if the project collapses, and Kenya and whoever may join Kenya before November, if they're withdrawn in January, you can rest assured that the aftermath is probably going to be worse than before you even had intervened. So this is the time, if there's some dynamic people in this transitional government, to start making tours of some of these European capitals and China, and reach out and say, this is not a U.S. project. We want you to play a role in this for the benefit of the people of Haiti. So that would be my suggestion to them.
And with that, we've come to the end of this week's episode of African News Review. And it would be remiss of me not to ask what the possible implication is in light of what happened in the United States for the African continent of you before you leave?
Well, you're talking about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Well, actually, I think it's not only his supporters, but even many Democrats are saying that the failed assassination may have actually boosted his prospects. As you know, the polls indicated that he was already leading slightly in some of the critical states that a U.S. president needs to win. And now the indication that more states, which had been presumed to be safe for Democrats, are now coming into play, meaning his chances have now increased in those states. So I think if you ask anybody right now who follows closely, they would not be surprised if Donald Trump is reelected as president of the United States. In fact, I think people that follow closely and would have an honest opinion would say that the only way it seems that the Democrats can hold on to the White House is if they have a candidate other than Joe Biden. And of course, people still point back to when the process, the concern really escalated after the presidential debate, where the president's age seemed to clearly show itself. There were moments when the camera captured him looking lost and confused, because he can't be helped being 81. That's what he is. He's 81. And there was that incident when he started talking about some of his policies, and then he lost his train of thought. And he ended up saying something like, "We finally killed Medicaid." Obviously, he meant to say that we killed the COVID pandemic, you see? So those raised many concerns, and the conversation, that was the only conversation that was in most of media, establishment media at least, until this assassination attempt on Donald Trump, which actually now raises even much more concern, because his supporters have played it to his advantage. You know, they now celebrate him as sort of like a messianic figure, you know, not just a regular human being, and a courageous person who was not crawling and hiding, but the minute he was lifted to his feet, was not ducking, was actually pumping his fist in the air and urging his supporters to fight. These are the kind of things that myth makers can turn into legend. And it seems that that's precisely what the myth makers are now doing. And look how sad it is. Even if Biden himself were to survive an incident like that, it would not help him at this stage, because he would still not be able to circumvent the age appearance obstacle, which was registered suddenly after that debate, you see? So the incumbent is in between a rock and a hard place. And obviously, a Trump presidency has consequences for Africa as well. Although, ironically, in the terms of the US intervention that have been most destructive to Africa historically in recent years, they've occurred during democratic administrations, you know, such as the intervention in Libya. That was, of course, as you know, under the presidency and vice presidency, respectively, of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. The US policy to ignore the multiple interventions into Rwanda by Uganda, intervention in the Congo, a violent, destructive intervention, by the armed forces of Rwanda and Uganda, and to turn a blind eye. That also occurred during democratic administrations in the United States. So one could make the argument that because of his lack of interest really in Africa, that somehow, paradoxically, the Trump presidency has been less harmful to Africa. Then that's the irony. Obviously, we don't know what will happen going forward. So that's my assessment.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned that yeah, because obviously his lack of interest and lack of, but the problem is one final thought from you with regards to what is the consequences of his presidency for Africans in the diaspora. By that I mean African Americans, those from the Caribbean, and those from Africa within the United States.
Very harmful, of course. As you know, he's an avowed bully when it comes to immigration. He's an enemy of non-European immigrants. As he said at the time that he referred to Haiti and African countries as a collection of, whole places. At that same time, he also said that why can we have more immigrants from places like Norway, you see? So his racist animus and playing the race card is his MO. That's how he operates, and that's how he became popular. Because as you know, and that's part of the fallacy of capital, right? And capitalism always has the people who are eating the crumbs fighting amongst themselves, while the elite are monopolizing the resources and the wealth. So now, in the last debate, he said immigrants are taking away black jobs. Think about that. And he knows that resonates because there is a segment of the lowly paid class that appeals to them by saying, well, yeah, these immigrants are taking these low wage jobs that I could be working, even though nobody really wants those type of back-breaking work. That many of them work actually not so much in the restaurants that you see here in the major cities. Many of them work on those farms, those fruit farms, like laboring, like almost in like enslavement-like condition, for very meager wages, Who would want to leave a city like New York or DC to go and work in those farms, you see? But that's not how the way it's played out. And Trump knows that, and he knows it's effective, right? So he plays that propaganda. When he launched his first campaign, as you recall, he referred to Mexicans as, drug dealers, rapists, and murderers, you see? And that resonates to also some working class European Americans, who blame their stagnant wages or the fact that they now need multiple jobs just to survive, blame it on immigrants, which of course is completely nonsense. It is that way because the very wealthy elite are increasingly monopolizing the greater share of wealth. Think about it. In a country where you can have a person like Jeff Bezos, how can anyone have more than $100 billion as their personal wealth? Think about that. And yet that is not seen as the problem. The problem is that immigrant who is working the most lowly wage paying job. And part of it, of course, is the media. Not part of it. The essential part of it is the media. And the media
not really relating the narrative the way it should be related. That if you have a handful of Jeff Bezos, there's only so much wealth that can be allocated to the other parts of society. So they are the real culprits. But do you see a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal or a CNN depicting the problem as being the people like Jeff Bezos? No. Instead, you have this false narrative American dream. If you work hard enough, you too can become a Jeff Bezos, you see? So the Jeff Bezos are insulated, right? And that poor immigrant, who some of them now coming from Africa, going to Brazil, and then making through the Darien Gap, some dying along the way, and some after those hundreds of miles journeys, making it to Texas and making it to New York City. Some are sleeping on the streets now. Some are bicycle vendors because they're not allowed to work without, permit. So they're delivering lunches and all that. That is really who is the threat to the American worker. But you see, but the nonsense, So we have a major challenge, We have a major challenge to have a Trump presidency, Very major challenge. And I was saying in a conversation with somebody that sometimes you need things to really get bad to really spark revolution. What we are seeing in African countries actually are aspects of revolution. Because even if, let's say, Ruto becomes so unpopular that the security forces step in, but Kenya is not associated with a coup, right? I'm just giving a very broad example because this is the point I want to make. And I could use this point for any other country, not necessarily Kenya. Even if the military steps in, the military would still have to address the same challenges, you see, of production, of debt, of not being able to create jobs, you see? And if the military are actually smart, they should not even bother. Let Ruto have that headache, Let the civilians have that headache. But sometimes it gets to a point where it's not tolerable. And that is subsequently what we saw in Burkina Faso, we saw in Niger, and we saw in Mali. And obviously, they're trying to take a different approach by saying, individually, we can't deal with it. They're realizing that Nkrumah was right. We need to come together. Is that what we'll see ultimately in more African regions? I don't think there's any solution that is different from that. So maybe we are in a herky-jerky way moving in that direction,
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you. And I would like you to have the final say. And for me, it's always remarkable sitting and listening to you because I think the insight you bring is just unique. And you, as always, you bring in the role of the media because you highlighted the fact that the media is the only reason why a convicted criminal would be running for office. And that will be the least of the matters being brought to fore. Can you imagine that?
Think about it. And has a very, very, very good chance of winning. You see? And the media that have been irresponsible for such a long time, they used to joke about this guy and give him all this, adulation, adoring media when they knew how vile this individual was. And now you've unleashed, sort of Frankenstein's monster. And now there's nothing you can do about it because now if you expose how terrible his policies really are, his core supporters are even much more emboldened. See, they're attacking our hero, you see? So at the end of the day, you, the media, corporate media, you get what you deserve, I hope there's some lessons to be taken from that, but I very much doubt it. So long as the media is conditioned by the bottom line consideration, you know? Can't be about profits when you're trying to tell the truth, man.
Yes, and good night to everyone, and Aluta continue.
Indeed, Aluta